Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your time and dedication to learn something new. Today we will be discussing gender identity and substance use disorders. How can we help? And I will proceed. I always start my presentations with who I am, just so we have some context in what we're learning about. Hello, my name is Riz Delpino. I'm a prevention educator for the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I'm the Mercer County Grant Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. So why this presentation? I always want to start also with this because there are a lot of different areas of expertise, but also people get really scared when they are introduced to something new and something that they don't really know. But this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. And this is for anyone that works with children in general, any person that works with youth. My perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences. So anything I come across as a prevention educator, as a person who's learning, then I will put that new information into my presentation so that I can give you the most up-to-date information. This is also evidence-informed and some evidence-based. Evidence-informed meaning I take studies, I take research, I take all these numbers, I consolidate them and put them in presentations that are the subject matter. And then I give you the resources to go through with me as we go through our presentation. And this is also some evidence-based in terms of all of our evidence-based curriculum and everything that I teach outside of this is also informing the information that we work with. So I do have some disclaimers before we actually officially get into the presentation, because I want to make clear what the groundwork will be and what we'll build up from there. LGBTQIA+ populations are especially vulnerable. That's why we're talking about them. There will be mentions of violence, self-harm, suicide, and other forms of abuse. That it is not explicit, but there will be numbers that may be triggering to some people who are listening and viewing. There is no debate on whether these people exist. Transgender and transsexual people, non-binary, non-gender, non-conforming people, these are all people that exist. And we are not going to not give them resources because they deserve those resources, and we are going to look for ways that we can accommodate those resources. I will be using the voices of those in the community to amplify their experiences. I will not be that voice. I am someone who is just using their voices to tell you what they are experiencing. I am not an expert. But all of my resources are empirical and evidence-based, meaning that these are not my opinions. These are things that are formed around the research that I find. And some people may ask, why are we presenting on something outside of what we would normally? And I think the question really is more about why don't we present things in a way that gives people resources regardless of what community they're a part of, and for us to highlight different parts and areas that are historically underrepresented and under-resourced. So while we look through that, while we try to understand that, we also want to know and should recognize that substance use disorders stem from a lot of areas of under-resources and being historically underrepresented. So that's why we're moving along with this. So an introduction to sort of some of the groundwork we're having. There are a lot of different LGBTQIA+ people. People obviously range on a spectrum, but LGBTQIA+ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, questioning, queer, intersex, and asexual. Now, gender and sexuality. A lot of the time when I explain this to people who may not have a huge conception of what that means, is think of it like mismatched socks. Sometimes socks match together, and that works very well. You're able to function through your day with these, matched socks. But sometimes you put on two different pairs of socks and it still goes in shoes and you still walk throughout the day. And it doesn't make sense to people sometimes, but they still wear them and it functions as the same purpose. So there's sort of there's the discrepancy. Gender is how you express your sex, how you feel. It's something that is represented in society, what you want to show the world around you, and what you want to show as your gender. Sexual orientation is your romantic preference. So gender is within you, sexuality is something that is outward, and your romantic experiences. Most of the time when we are talking about gender and sexuality, it's just something that feels natural and most authentic for the person who is experiencing these feelings. I also have just a couple of flags at the bottom, just so we can sort of see some of those and start to see the prevalence of those experiences. So we're also going to be looking at definitions. So gender identity. Gender identity is something that is basically the gender you feel that you identify with the most. And there are a huge range of gender identities, but I'm sort of going to break it down as transgender, cisgender, and gender nonconforming. And then we sort of go in between because gender and sexuality, as we had stated before, is a scale. So transgender is someone who changes their sex or gender, and or. So you can change one or the other. You can change both. Cisgender is someone who is born into their sex who does not feel the need to change it. And gender nonconforming, basically you're non-binary, and they have a couple of things here, but gender nonconforming is essentially someone who doesn't conform to the idea of what gender could be. A lot of the time, people who are non-binary and gender fluid, agender for that matter, don't really have an attached feeling to what gender could be for them. Sometimes people wake up and they feel more like one gender than the other. Sometimes people wake up and they sort of fall on the spectrum of what that gender looks like. These are not necessarily interchangeable, but they are under the same category. Gender fluid is someone who does not identify with conventional standards of sex or gender. So also understand that when we're talking about gender, it refers to the socially constructed roles and behaviors and identities that both women and men go through and navigate their environments on an everyday basis. Obviously, gender identity and the way people express their gender does play a part in how people perceive them and how they perceive themselves. Also, it exists on a continuum, and there are people who can change over time with gender, but also understand that gender roles in general have changed throughout decades. So something that could be considered something men do exclusively could be later on something that women also do, or eventually women have exclusively, such as the change from color associated gender. So for example, if you're looking at the color pink, that used to be something that was a manly color, and then that's also been transitioned over to women who now have that color. So as we're sort of looking through the definitions, this video in particular is something that I feel definitely does do a part in explaining what gender identity is, but also this person is gender nonconforming, meaning that sometimes those things can be difficult for people to understand. So when you have people who sit down, have those conversations, it's a respectful and interesting and sort of intimate way of looking at it. This is also through a YouTube channel called Hi Ho Kids. And I think they're amazing in a lot of different ways, but really what they do is they sort of expand on the idea of what kids can learn and what they can understand at such a vulnerable age. So here we go.
Let's really start getting into some questions. Do you wish you were raised not as a girl, but just an anti?
Yes, totally. It would have been great to just be marked like X-gender, you know, not boy, not girl. Coming into my own skin later in life would have been a lot more easier. Did you always know you're a girl?
Yeah.
Okay. Has that ever changed or for you or?
No.
No. How did you know you were a girl?
I feel it in my body.
Yeah.
I'm a boy, not a girl.
But people think he's a girl.
Oh, so people think you're a girl.
I've been called a girl, I think 309 times now. And I like my hair just how it is.
What makes a boy a boy?
An X and a Y chromosome.
Oh, so like, is there anything to name, like on the outside of somebody that makes them a boy?
Like,
Genitalia.
what?
Yeah.
No, that's also genetics, but like...
Well, yeah, but like, that's on the outside, I'm just saying.
Are we talking about like...
Like, looking or
Emotions.
like emotional or like hormonal or like genetical?
Or like feelings?
Genetical.
Like, I don't know where we're going. Like,
Yeah, I don't either.
Have you ever heard about like how people try to say like pink is a girl thing, and then like how blue is like a boy color?
Yeah, I hear about that, even though blue is one of my favorite colors.
Yeah, right. So you see how confusing that could feel like when
Yeah.
it's like, I want to do this and that.
if a parent offers the option with no bias, hey, you can play with this doll or you can play with this ball, and the boy chooses the ball, my theory is because early humans, like the men, as far as I'm concerned, hunted. And so it's sort of like genetically men preferred things that moved around. I know that's like completely a theory in terms of.
I mean, is there a reason why the men were the ones hunting?
Probably because they were stronger.
And I think that's where I kind of like, oh, really? Well, I'm strong. Why can't I be a hunter too?
Well, yeah, but like in terms of like muscle mass, men have like, and I mean, they probably weren't thinking about that.
Does your family ever get mad at you for what you want to identify?
Oh yeah. I think it's different now that I'm an adult. But growing up, my mom would force me to wear a dress that I don't really want to wear.
I don't really like wearing dresses or skirts too, so I feel really uncomfortable when I'm like wearing the skirt.
Yeah, but did you get to choose your outfit today?
No.
So you know exactly how I feel then.
Yeah.
Oh.
How do you know if somebody's gender nonconforming? Is it okay to ask somebody what their gender is?
So it's a lot better to ask about the person's pronouns.
That would be like he or she or they.
Right. Versus if I said,
What's your gender?
yeah.
Okay. So I think that is such a good presentation on what gender and non-binary issues sort of look like, just a baseline of understanding what we're first diving into, you know, inches into feet kind of thing. So I highly suggest actually looking at this YouTube channel because they do so many different things and so many different ways and walks of life are introduced to children. And they have such respectful conversations that you sit down and sometimes they're uncomfortable, but that's okay. So I think that is a great introduction into what that should look like. Now we're going to be moving on. So there are some risk factors when it comes to being gender nonconforming and transsexual and transgender. So we're going to sort of be talking about that, but specifically, what are some risk factors for substance use disorder? There are a lot of different risk factors. One of them is experiencing systemic and individual violence. Also, anything that deals with ACEs. Now, I've talked about ACEs at length before, but ACEs essentially is adverse childhood experiences. And what the essentially founding reality was that people who had experiences that were very traumatic in their youngest and formative years, then it actually affected their behavior later on in life and how they navigated their world. So generational trauma, home life, bullying, poverty, abuse, these are all things that can be adverse childhood experiences that affect the way people navigate their experiences. Now, I also have a video that I had done recently for Women's History Month in March, and with sexual violence and substance use disorder. I'll be linking that video below, and also Talking to Your Child Before It Matters, where I talk about ACEs in great detail, because I think that it's so important for us to understand that substance use disorder is not holistically on the individual. It's about how people navigate their environment and respond to the resources that they have and the behaviors that they know and models are after. So I think that there's so much more nuance to it than us just saying, well, they're sick or they have a disease. Yes, they do. It's something that's hard to battle, but there are so many other factors that come into play when we're talking about this too. And when we sort of look at substance use disorder, we can understand why a lot of transsexual and transgender and gender nonconforming people do have substance use disorders in a varying capacity and spectrum, because there are quite a bit of numbers on trans and non-binary people who talk about being survivors of sexual violence. Now, I do want to preface some sort of trigger warning or anything like that, because I will be talking about numbers, and some of these can be difficult for people to hear. So forgive me as I just sort of go through some of these numbers, but it is good for us to understand what a lot of the youth do face when they are interacting with these sorts of experiences. So this this resource right here, vaw.net.org, they just do a lot of studies. And what they really sort of look at is they were looking at transgender and transsexual experiences. And this was a survey that was done in the United States across the board, all over the United States in 2015. So anyone that identified as transgender or non-conforming basically fill this out, and these are the numbers that we have. So nearly half, about 46% of respondents were verbally harassed in the past year because of being transgender. Nearly 1 in 10 respondents were physically attacked in the past year because of being transgender. Nearly half, 47% of respondents were sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime, and 1 in 10 were sexually assaulted in the past year. In communities of color, these numbers are higher. 53% respondents were sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and 13% were sexually assaulted in the last year. 72% of respondents have done sex work, 65% of respondents have experienced homelessness, and 61% of respondents with disabilities reported being sexually assaulted in their lifetime, as well as 54% experiencing some form of intimate partner violence, including acts of coercive control and physical harm. Now, those are a lot of numbers. I will be setting the study below in the description if you're watching this on the YouTube channel. But I just want this to be clear that there are a lot of different areas for us to look at. And when we see these numbers, it's not something saying, oh, the world is terrible, people are terrible, you know, what can we do about this? It's more about knowing what can we do about this? That if we know what the numbers are, we know where the risk factors are. If we know where the numbers are, we know what to mitigate. So these numbers and these resources are really important for us to know in the first place. Now, if we're going to be talking about the numbers a little bit more, there are some graphics here that I feel are really hit home to the point that transsexual and transgender youth and LGBTQIA youth in general are really facing some of these epidemics of homelessness, but also navigating through their environment in a way that hopefully we can understand why it could be harmful if we don't provide resources to that population. Now, they did a survey. This is the Center for American Progress. They do lots of surveys based on a lot of different things. And so what they had essentially did was they were looking at the different numbers compared to the youth population, and youth meaning anyone who is 12 to 22, I believe. I may be getting those numbers a little bit wrong, but the resource is there. And the youth population is that of this population, 5 to 10% at LGBTQIA+. Of the homeless youth population, 20 to 40% are LGBTQIA+. Now, that's about 2.8 million, 1.6 to 2.8 million homeless people in the United States. And the estimates are that 40%-ish of them are LGBTQIA. Now, of that my apologies, of that, homeless gay and transgender youth see higher rates of abuse and victimization. Homeless youths who have been sexually assaulted are 25% higher than those who are heterosexual. Rejection based on school, there's a lot of rejection at school. 44% is the portion of homeless gay and transgender youth who reported being asked by someone on the street to exchange sex for money, food, and drugs, and shelter, compared to 26% of straight homeless youth. Of the homeless youth who abuse alcohol, LGBTQIA+ individuals are about 15, my apologies, I can't do math, are 42% compared to 27%. Harassment in schools based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. You can really look through these and understand a lot of those numbers. So a lot of them are in foster care. And this one I thought was really interesting, but also something in an area where we could definitely mitigate and understand where that's coming from. They asked workers in out-of-home placements, and they basically said, are these youth safe here? And a lot of the professional staff, 88%, said that transgender youth were not safe in group home environments. And then it goes into budgeting. Budgeting and numbers are not necessarily the thing that are my favorite things to talk about because numbers kind of scare me. But these essentially are great numbers for us to look at, but also for us to understand where we could do better. So there's that. Great numbers, great resource, and something that I will also put below. All these resources will be in the description below. Now, we're sort of still talking about especially at-risk youth who are trans youth, but we're going to be talking about the medical barriers that trans youth face, and essentially people who are transitioning at younger ages, because people are transitioning younger and younger. These are medical barriers, and while they seek out gender-affirming treatment and hormones, there are a lot of different places that we could look for us to say, well, we could definitely do better there. So there are some interesting statistics But this one in particular was really interesting, and it is the National Transgender Discrimination Survey Report on Health and Healthcare. It is 24 pages long, so if you want to make do with it, have fun searching through it. I actually had a really good time pulling out a lot of those numbers, but about 7,000 people were asked to do this survey, and they were responded to a 70-question survey. And this survey is pervasive for a lot of reasons. It sheds light on a lot of different areas of growth in our healthcare systems. Now, when we are looking at trans youth in general, what we need to understand is that because it is something that is inward, our sexuality is outward, but because it's something that's inward, they feel that they need to change their physical appearance for them to match how they feel on the inside, much like anybody else would. For example, I know that I like my hair long, therefore I always keep my hair long. If I cut my hair short or somebody cut my hair short, I'd be very upset about that. So for some people, these are really important aspects to them because it is a part of how they navigate their environment. Now, when we were looking at this survey for health and healthcare, I'm going to be looking through the numbers again, so forgive me while I'm sort of spewing them off, but as they were sort of looking through the gender affirming process in healthcare, over a quarter of the respondents misused drugs or alcohol specifically to cope with discrimination they faced due to their gender identity and expression. So that's something to look at. A staggering 41% of respondents attempted suicide compared to my apologies. Am I reading the right? Yes. 1.6% of the general population with unemployment, low income, and sexual and physical. 28% of respondents were subject to harassment in medical settings. And this one was something that I really didn't like reading, but something that I found interesting. 1 to 2% of transgender patients reported being assaulted in physicians' offices, meaning that they were in doctors' offices, and 1 to 2% of the 7,000 people experienced some sort of physical assault, or physical or any sort of assault. So that is about 700 people. Now that's staggering for a lot of different reasons, but the one that I found interesting, and the one that we will be talking about later on, especially because it's so important for youth to sort of navigate their resources, is 50% of the people that responded reported being the informant to their doctor on their specific transgender issues, meaning that 50% of these people had to be the expert in their own experiences to talk to doctors to get the treatments they needed. Now, that is meaning that 50% of doctors did very well, or at least better, in understanding trans experiences. But that means that there are 50% of people in the medical and healthcare industry that could really use a lot of information on how to interact with their transgender and transsexual patients. So we are looking about that. And so also, I want to also look at this specifically because it talks about drug use. NBC News sort of talked about a lot of different things, but there was a study done by the Journal of School Health, and they found transgender students were 2.5 times more likely than non-transgender students to use cocaine and methamphetamines in their lifetime, and also twice as likely to report the misuse of prescription pain medication. Now, these are all ways for people to cope with their experiences, but once again, we're going to be talking about different identities and how they may play a role. So pronoun usage is important, and we're going to be shifting gears just for a second for us to understand that when you're interacting with transsexual and transgender youth and gender nonconforming youth, it should be understood that whatever pronouns they have, we should just accommodate that because it is something so simple as part of speech. So a lot of people ask, why do pronouns matter? And there are a lot of different reasons why pronouns may matter, but they are used in everyday speech for everything that we do in referring to a noun. Whether it's a table, a person, a place, a thing, whatever it is, pronouns matter because they are a part of our ingrained society. They are a part of how we address things and people and places that exist. Now, what we sort of need to understand and how has it been explained to me is that when we are using words that aren't necessarily informed in the best way, it shows that it's a reflection of the values that we have or the inability for us to filter our words in order to present the information clearly to the other person in a respectful and decent way. Now, I have an example of this, and essentially what we can say is, you can say, I was very lazy today, or you could say, I did not get a lot done today. Now, one or the other basically gets the same thing across, but the connotation is different in that when people say words, when it matters, it means that when people are talking to one another, they are giving the literal translation and direct translation of what they are thinking. There are connotations to every word that we use. So understanding that if we can adjust to saying, I was really lazy today, to talking to a coworker and saying, I did not get a lot done today, then we can accommodate the change in pronoun usage as well. I'm going to be playing this first, and then we'll be going back to a couple of studies on why pronouns do matter.
What their gender is?
So it's a lot better to ask about the person's pronouns.
That would be like he or she or they.
Right. Versus if I said,
What's your gender?
yeah, what's your gender? Are you a boy or are you a girl?
Seems like you're very interested in knowing.
Yeah. So have you ever been confused by using they, them as a pronoun for someone?
I mean, sometimes it can be confusing, but it's also, I also have to remember that that's the pronouns that they've chosen, and I need to respect that. I've noticed someone in my class, first period, has the pronouns that they would like on their backpack.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool. I've been to the Philippines.
Oh, I like the Philippines.
Oh, you've been there too?
Yeah.
That's where my family's from. And
Where my mom's from.
okay, they use the term siya. So siya is like all-encompassing of every gender, you know?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
There's a girl who works at my tutoring center, and she goes by they, them, and then a lot of times, like I just didn't call her she, and then I'm like, oh wait, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Did she ever, or sorry, see, even I made that mistake. Do they ever address it with, like, or correct people who may use a different pronoun for them?
No, but somebody else might.
How does being non-binary affect your day-to-day life?
Looking for a job. There's times where, like, before going into an interview, I totally just want to wear, like, these slacks and, like, a button-up shirt, but will it be more likely to get the job if I wore, like, a dress suit or something, you know?
Why is gender such a big deal?
You know, sometimes I wish it really wasn't. How do you feel about it? Is it a big deal to you?
No, I just figure, like, why can't they just be a person?
Okay. So there you can finish up the video on your own time. I just want to be careful of the time that we have here, but also knowing that Hi-Ho Kids is a great resource, but this video in particular, and the way that they're talking, just for us to understand that when they're talking about pronouns and gender, they're still being respectful of the things that they don't understand. And that is something that I think anybody can learn from. Now, there are quite a few different areas of expertise that we have here. So I'm going to be sort of listing through a lot of the research that has been done. There was a great study done on the University of, I apologize, it's UCSF. University of California, San Francisco, my apologies. So they talked about pronouns and why they matter. And essentially what they had found was that pronouns matter for a lot of different reasons. And we're looking at the correlation between people using the pronouns and people not having their pronouns being used, and the correlation between that and mental health. Now, there are a couple different numbers on there, but this one has a lot of numbers as well. And when they're talking about the quantified social aspect of transgender youth and mental health, what they're talking about here is that they were looking at how youth responded and how over time they were able to have their pronouns respected, and whether or not they needed more depression medication, whether or not they needed more clinical medication, things like that, for them to navigate their environments, and that their symptoms of their mental health disorders tended to lessen if their pronouns and chosen names were being used. Also, non-binary and transgender statistics on chosen names and preferred pronouns were also a part of this this study as well. And I did want to reiterate some of these points. So it came from a cohort sample of 129 transgender and gender nonconforming youth in 3 US cities. And after adjusting for certain characteristics for support, family life, things like that, more context that would sort of look at more of the ACEs that they may have experienced, they were looking at suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior. So we'll be talking about that just in a second. So an increase sort of saw that if people were using their chosen name, that there was a decrease in depressive symptoms by 29% in suicidal ideation, a decrease of 56% in suicidal behavior, and were similar results when individually tested specific for chosen name use. So using chosen name and the correct pronouns for that person actually lowered their risk of wanting to harm themselves and thinking about harming themselves, which I find fascinating. But also knowing that if we use the correct pronouns, if we use the correct names, if we use the words that people want us to use for them, that can be a very simple change, literally does save their life. So I thought that was truly fascinating. And to understand that their depressive symptoms did lower when that was used as well. So that is something to keep in mind when people are sort of looking and interacting with transgender and nonconforming youth. All right, here we are, moving on. Now, I would be remiss if I talked about transgender and nonconforming youth if I didn't talk about trans youth of color and the intersectionality that exists within that context. Now, when we are looking at intersectionality, there was actually quite a few different articles, and intersectionality is something that is moved to the forefront of a lot of different areas and movements in the United States for us to sort of understand the context, such as a lot of different social movements, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, LGBTQIA+ communities. These are all sort of things that exist on layers on top of each other. Now, this term was actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and essentially there was a study done on Black women and how they were not being promoted in the workforce and why they weren't experiencing as many benefits from their workplaces compared to white women, white men, and Black men. And they were saying, okay, so if white women were being promoted, then maybe it's my race. And then they found out that Black men were being promoted, and they said, well, then what is it? So they sort of understood that the intersectionality of it really does make a difference in understanding that Black women were someone who was part of a community of color, but also understanding that they were a woman. So there was this other layer of intersectionality or of discrimination that may have existed. So when we sort of look at one system existing and another system existing, understanding that those systems don't exist separately, that in the United States, and especially any ism or system in the world, all things exist on layers on top of each other. So depending on the context, depending on the environment of that person, different layers present themselves, or different systems present themselves more readily than others. And when we're talking about intersectionality, it's important for us to know that transgender youth of color are especially at risk when it comes to any sort of substance use disorder and any sort of mental health disorder, as well as suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, and being perpetrated against. Now, when we are talking about this, there is a great article on transgender youth of color and resilience, and how they they took 13 trans youth, and what they essentially did was they said, all right, we're going to follow their journey on negotiating oppression and finding support in the areas that they found it to be. And they looked at 5 different areas of this. One was evolving simultaneous self-identification of racial, ethnic, and gender identities simultaneously. 2, being aware of adultism, meaning how much do they have to be an adult, being aware of being treated like an adult, even if they are a youth. 3, self-advocacy and educational experiences, meaning that if they are the only trans or open transsexual or transgender or gender nonconforming person in their education system, how do they navigate through that? 4, finding one's place in the LGBTQIA+ communities surrounding them. And 5, use of social media to affirm one's identities as a transgender youth of color. Now, I didn't really touch upon technology in this presentation because it is a whole other piece, and it is something that deserves its own presentation. But essentially, what they had found was that if people, especially these youth, if they had support in all 5 areas, they were less likely to have suicidal ideation. They were also more likely to flourish and bounce back and create that resilience while they were going through their trans youth of color experience. Now, when we are talking about media, we're not going to be really touching upon that in this presentation, but I do want to say that media and access to internet is a great place for people to look when they feel marginalized and don't really feel like they have support in other places. So that at least if they know that other people exist out there with the same experience as them, it's much easier for them to get through life and for them to navigate their experiences while they are still stuck in a place they may not want to be. Also, the Trevor Project is a great LGBTQIA resource. I sort of wanted to look at this just because I feel it is necessary. Once again, we will be talking about some suicidal ideation, so I do want to put some trigger warnings there. But as we're looking at numbers here, they looked at LGBTQIA plus people who had attempted suicide in the past year. And what they said was, across all racial and ethnic identities, youth who identified as transgender and or non-binary were at the highest risk for attempting suicide. Rates were highest among natives, 37%, and Hispanics who identified transgender and non-binary. So that is something to look into. And also for us to understand that these are the numbers and these are the spaces that need work. So we can really look to resources to help those communities. So we'll be moving on from there. Once again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or any responses to anything, obviously put that in the chat as well. So a lot of the time when we sort of look at this, there's a lot of numbers. There's a lot of stuff to understand. And for us to know, especially in this field where we're like, okay, a lot of people are going to have a struggle with looking at these numbers, understanding how to help, and how do we sort of navigate these resources to give them to people so that we can understand how they navigate their environment, but also make sure that we are doing the best we can for them. Well, help set a space up where children can practice their names. For me specifically, whenever I enter a Zoom meeting, because it is 2021, I put in my name and also my preferred pronouns. And hopefully we set the precedent for people to understand that that's a good space for people to sort of use their pronouns in that way. Also believe people when they talk about their struggle. If they say they're having a hard time with their gender identity, if they've had experiences where people invalidate their gender identity, believe them, because most of the time discrimination and the way that people feel and the way that people perceive things is still a feeling that comes from a place that it still needs work, regardless of whether or not it legally happened or it socially happened. If they perceive it that way, there's still work to be done to make sure that person is getting the resources they need. Also, allow gender-neutral bathrooms on the campus of the school. Get involved in making environmental change. That is one big way for transgender and non-binary youth to have that space to make sure that they feel safe in any bathroom they enter. But if you can't, then gender-neutral bathrooms are a great space to start. Watch the language being used. Words do matter. If you misgender someone or if you don't use the right pronouns, just move on, apologize, and then go from there. Also, there is a great book here. It is called, I believe, The Red Crayon. Red, a crayon story. And essentially it's a red, like a crayon that is actually blue on the inside, but red on the outside. And it sort of talks about how this crayon changed from being, or wanted to change from being red to blue, because that's how they felt on the inside. And it is a very simple way for people to understand what gender identity looks like, but also just to understand that people sometimes on the inside feel different than what they look like on the outside, whether it's gender identity or something else for that matter. So I think having that book in any space is really important, even if it is a children's book. There are many more books that illustrate that, but that is the simplest version that I have found and that I think is the best resource to sort of start that conversation. Also, uncomfortable is okay. Have you slipped up on their pronouns? Practice. that's something that is really easy. And for us also to understand, are you not ready to have a conversation that the children you work with may need? Well, that's fine. But the best thing you can do for the child that you're working with or for the child that's around you, remember that they came to you because they are the most comfortable with you about these issues. Meaning that if you are unable to have that conversation right then and there, presenting them to somebody else could be a good part for to mitigate that specific crisis, but also understanding that if you still want to be that person in that child's life, if you want to be that person that they go to in that child's life, then understand that you need to do the work. Regardless of what that looks like, regardless of what that sounds like, doing the work to get to where they need you to be is a really important part of that, because you're the person that they need to be comfortable with if you want to be that person. Now, in the meantime, also to speed up your learning process, practice with people. I know, for example, my one friend has a child who is gender nonconforming, and they want to use the words they as a pronoun so that when they are referring to their child, they use the word they. And this person slips up every now and again, and they just move on from there. They say, oh, my apologies. And then they were talking about that child in the context of not even the child being around them, but just practicing in general so that they finally get it in their head that this is the type of pronoun that my child wants. I will use they. Also, I have a great video on transgender people and how they sort of look at their pronouns, but also navigate their job and their environment. This video is also from Hi-Ho Kids. I don't know if you can tell, but I definitely have a bias towards this YouTube channel. But it is actually Kids Meet a Transgender Soldier. And this person, she navigates through being transgender in the military, but also coming to terms with it in a space that tended to be less than welcoming. So there are definitely parts that are uncomfortable in that people say things that may not necessarily be the best way to put them. But it also shows that taking on the graciousness of those conversations can be really important, that when you have conversations with somebody, that you are able to give them grace, give them decency, and most of the time, if not all the time, they mirror it back. So here we go.
Came down to, I can't fake it anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like holding a secret.
Exactly.
Like if you have a crush on someone, you're like, I'm not gonna ever tell anyone. And then like you tell them and then they're like, ooh.
But afterwards, it's kind of worth it because you're not carrying it around anymore. I had tried to keep it a secret for a really, really long time because I was afraid that a lot of my friends wouldn't understand. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them didn't.
Does that mean you lost friends?
They weren't very good friends, but afterwards, I made new friends, friends that know me.
Understood.
Exactly.
You like ever nervous to like go out in public?
When you're first starting out, it's one of the scariest things, but I think it's pretty important to be visible.
What was your name before you were Katie?
A lot of trans people aren't very comfortable with talking about what their old names were. It's something that other people used to call me. No, it's okay. I promise it's okay.
Who was the hardest person to tell?
I had to tell my commander. And at the time, I didn't know if that was going to be the end of my career. Luckily, I was able to fight to stay in. There was a couple times when they tried to find some things I was doing wrong. Because if they could find something I was doing wrong, then they could say, we don't want you to be in the Army anymore.
That makes sense.
But they couldn't find anything, because I'm really good at my job.
Is there still a chance that you might get kicked out?
There are people who are trying to make it very difficult for me to stay in.
For example, maybe like Donald Trump.
So,
I hope he's not listening to this.
Yes.
Well, what do you know about that?
He doesn't really like women.
Why do you think they're gonna change it?
Because there's still a lot of people who don't think that that we can do our jobs, even if we're doing them every day. Part of the whole issue is people disagreeing about whether transgender medical care should be covered, because they say, I don't want my tax dollars paying for that.
Why not?
That is a very good question.
I just wanted to ask you if you felt like you wanted to be different, or would you rather just be like normal, like born a girl?
I didn't really have that choice. That'd be a hard, that's a good question. If I didn't have to go through all this, then yeah, I probably would have chosen that. But that's not what happened. I didn't really have a choice in the matter.
Are you happier now as a woman?
Definitely. I've always been a woman. Now I don't have to worry about people seeing me as something else.
Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you.
Bye, Katie.
Bye. It was great to meet you.
Great to meet you too.
I always love looking at their interactions with the kids after they have presented or given their information that they want, because it's always so respectful and wholesome at the end. But obviously that conversation wasn't necessarily comfortable for any of them to have, but it was a good, respectful conversation that got points across that helps them understand where this person was coming from. And I think that is something that we should honor. Closing out sort of my presentation, I always do a couple of things when it comes to this, but how do we change the cycle? Well, one is acceptance. Acceptance is a huge part of trans youth and LGBTQIA youth in general navigating their environment, but also understanding that there's a place for them at the table, that there's a place for them wherever they are, whatever they need, we are there for them so that they know that they're going to be okay and there's a soft place to land. Social programs that serve all communities, but also part of a prevention agency, it is best to be well informed of the people that they are serving, regardless of whether or not that community exists for one person in the community or hundreds of people in the community. If we can reach all people in the community, that should be the goal. Also, accessibility to prevention programs to LGBTQIA+ people, especially transgender and transsexual youth people and trans youth of color, may have experiences where they don't really like to navigate prevention programs. So being those people where we can go into the schools, where we can be in spaces that makes them feel comfortable, can also be part of that process too. So maybe not streamlining being in front of the classroom, but also sitting down with groups, interest groups, and seeing what needs to be done, what the work could be. I actually work very closely with the Bayard Reston Center in Princeton, and they work very closely with transgender youth. And we've been given great opportunities and experiences to look at the way trans youth interact and navigate their environment. And we've been able to give them resources. Also, harm reduction strategies. These are basically a lot of different things, but harm reduction strategies are essentially saying, all right, maybe you have a substance use disorder, maybe you have some sort of ideation that doesn't help your experience. Let's get you medicine, let's get you help, and then treat that, and also treat any other transsexual or transgender issues that may come along. Also, therapy, possibly best for coping skills, especially people that turn to substances when they are feeling a type of way that could possibly hurt them later on. Also knowing that there should be policies that protect youth, that in schools there should be harassment, intimidation, and bullying policies that are enforced, should be actively sought to make sure that that exists. Also that policies such as gender neutral bathrooms to make sure that exists if that's what the trans youth are comfortable with. Also voting for people who don't hurt the ones that you care about could also be something part of that process as well. And also know that labels are important to most youth, but each label needs to be treated with equitable care. And that means that if someone decides that they are non-binary and then they're actually transsexual or transgender later on, then honoring that they were non-binary and we're going to move on to say that they are now transgender. And that basically does, what that basically does is if we give the same energy to each label that they have and they come out with, then they're able to feel as if they can do it again and again if they need to, until they find the right thing for them. Also, last thing, representation matters. Share stories that exist around transgender and transsexual and gender nonconforming people, because it is an important part of the youth understanding that, you know, things are terrible right now sometimes, and there are people that made it through, or there are people that understand, or there are people that made a good thing for themselves, made a good life out of what seemed could be nothing. And I think that that's the most important part for children, especially, to understand that they can do so many things in regardless, in spite of, and holistically because of their labels and experiences. And they are the only ones that can give meaning to all of those things. But if we give the representation and the stories, then we can move on from there, and they can feel empowered to do the best things they can for themselves. I also close out every presentation with quotes, just because I feel it sort of surmises what has been taking place, what has been presented, but also for us to understand that people in communities that we talk about are there, they are present, and they are advocates in their own right for their communities. Now, the first one I have is a South African visual arts artist who is non-binary. Her name is Zanele Maholi, and my apologies if I'm not saying that correctly, but essentially what they had said was, if I wait for someone else to validate my existence, it will mean that I'm shortchanging myself. And I think that speaks for itself. And then we also have here a quote from Cooper Lee Bombardier, who is a transgender man. And he essentially, he is a book author living in Canada. And he said, it isn't about becoming another person. I already am who I am. I just want my body to reflect that. It's not like I'm suddenly changing from the person you always know. And this is more about your willingness to see who I've always been. And I also think that those are beautiful, wonderful words for a lot of different reasons. But for us to understand that even in this context, youth in general who want to be something else, who want to be the best versions of themselves, their most authentic self, we should honor that and give them resources and let them know that they are being brave for wanting something that may not be considered normal or of the norm. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all of your time and resource to be here, to want to learn something new. We always appreciate people coming around for that. Also, I have a bunch of resources that I will be sending out for those that are interested in that. Next week, we will be talking about sexuality and providing resources to youth. So we're really looking forward to that. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your time, and see you next week.